Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Elections have recently been held in Iran. Ebrahim Raisi is now president of the authoritarian West Asian country. He's second only in power to the Islamic theocracy's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. What does Raisi's election mean for Iran and for the world? Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
So who is Ebrahim Raisi?
Well, he's a hardliner, and that's to say he's been head of the judiciary, he's the judiciary chief, and under his leadership, a large number of people have been executed in Iran, and also he's currently being sanctioned by the United States for his alleged personal involvement in the execution of a number of political prisoners in 1988 at the tail end of the war between Iran and Iraq. So he may be the first Iranian leader that's been actually sanctioned before he gets into take on the top leadership. The circumstances which he's elected was also important. He won by a landslide, but he won from the lowest turnout in Iran's electoral history since the revolution of 1979. About 48% of those eligible to vote turned out. So it seems that I think for many countries outside Iran, the election of a hardline is a bit demoralizing. But we'll just have to wait and see whether the worst fears are realized.
What does his election mean for ordinary Iranians?
Well, that's the key question, Bruce. Many ordinary Iranians, and particularly those ones who stayed away from the election, are extremely concerned about the shrinking of the Iranian economy since sanctions. And you may recall that when Mr. Trump came in, he withdrew America from the Iran nuclear deal. He also reinvigorated and reintroduced sanctions against the regime. And those sanctions have been disastrous for Iran's economic performance. Iran depends heavily on the export of oil. That channel has been largely blocked and deprived of the ability to earn hard currency from its major export. The Iranian economy has been struggling, and that meant that the currency has come under pressure, and there's been inflation, about 46% running at the moment. So I think for many ordinary Iranians, they are desperate for economic relief and to see an upturn in the economy with all that brings, that is more jobs available, etc.
Do you think ordinary Iranians, you're saying that they're experiencing this hardship under the sanctions that are coming from outside, do they have any grievances with the government apart from what the US is doing to them and the effect that is having?
Right. It's very difficult to be absolutely crystal clear on this. To be fair to the government, the economic effects of the sanctions are severe. Whoever was in power would have to deal with that. And secondly, they've had another problem, which is the impact of COVID-19. The government has had to borrow quite a bit of money to try to ameliorate the effects of COVID-19, and Iran's been quite severely affected by COVID-19. So it's been a bit of a perfect economic storm, the impact of the sanctions and also COVID-19. And I think that means that the new leadership led by Mr. Raisi will have to try, he's pledged to restore the Iran nuclear deal and get sanctions lifted. He's pledged to do that, but whether he can achieve it or not is another matter. But I think in terms of his political support, it's imperative that he does.
What are the implications of his election for the world, including New Zealand?
It's very difficult to be absolutely precise about that. The opening signs, his first press conference, were quite demoralising because although he made the welcome noise about, or a positive noise I ought to say, about Iran wanting the restoration of the nuclear deal, which is something the Biden administration wants, and the Europeans have been working very hard on. So that's good. He made, he said things like the construction of the anti-ballistic missile system, which is worrying a lot of Iran's neighbours, not least Israel, but also some of the Sunni countries of the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, he said is non-negotiable. He also said Iran's support for militant groups in a number of countries. Its support for Hezbollah, its involvement in the Syrian civil war is also non-negotiable. So he wants a deal, but he seems to want it on his own terms. To be fair, it wasn't Iran that walked away from the nuclear deal, it was the United States. So he has got a point there. But on the other hand, we'll just have to wait and see. I think a crucial thing is how the new president responds in office. Often hardliners become quite pragmatic in office. He must know that there's a fair degree of political disillusionment, particularly amongst young Iranians, which has been shown by very low turnout. And so he needs to actually get the deal, the Iran nuclear deal, restored as quickly as possible and to get some economic relief. Now he's probably calculating that he can have his cake and eat it, that he can get the restoration of the nuclear deal, he can get economic relief, and he continue his ambitious program of projecting Iran's influence throughout the Middle East. But that may or may not be possible. We will wait and see. I think the crucial thing, to answer your question though, Bruce, is whether Mr. Raisi turns out to be a pragmatist or a firebrand hardliner who basically just continues down the route that he seems to have followed in his previous career.
And for New Zealand, do we get touched by this at all, or does
Yes.
We do?
Iran used to be a big trade partner for New Zealand in the 1980s. I think it was taking quite a sizable chunk of our lamb exports at one point. Since 2016, our trade with Iran has steadily deteriorated, not least because of the sanctions. I think it's down now to, I think last year, if you look at the figures for 2020, exports to Iran were in the close to, I think it was 2.87 million, close to $3 million they were worth to New Zealand. That's relatively modest. But there's certainly people in both countries who'd like to see that trade turnover lifted, trade performance for both countries lifted. And so in a sense, it is a country that New Zealand has traditionally had quite a strong interest in the Middle East. And I suppose from New Zealand's point of view, the ideal scenario would be to get the Iran nuclear deal restored and for Iran to begin to open up a bit with the rest of the world, and including the prospects of reviving what used to be quite a strong trade relationship between the two countries.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.